And there we go. So welcome to tonight's Out of the Archives event. I'm Joan Lacqua. I'm Executive Director of the History Project, and I'm super excited to see you all here tonight and to welcome you to our conversation with Jeremy Atherton Lin on Gay Bar, Why We Went Out with Sound and Vision. If you're new to the History Project, we are Boston's LGBTQ community archives. So it's our mission to document, preserve, and share the LGBTQ plus history of Boston. We focus on Boston as a city, Massachusetts as a state, and regionally New England. We are a volunteer-driven organization, so your support and your signal boosting and your follows on social media help us to grow and to do the work that we do. And I will put some links for donating into the chat along with our social media. Thank you in advance for following and donating. And tonight with us, we have Jeremy Atherton Lin. Jeremy is an Asian American essayist based in Los Angeles and East Sussex, England. His debut book, Gay Bar, is the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named one of 2021's best books by the New York Times, NPR, Vogue, and Art Forum. Jeremy is writing his second book, Deep House, a cultural memoir about cross-border love before gay marriage, slated for 2024 publication. So Jeremy's going to present tonight, and at the end, we'll have time for a Q&A. And Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks, Joan. I'm going to share my screen. So basically, I'm going to give this slideshow for probably about 45 minutes, leaving some room for questions. So we're looking about an hour this evening. And thank you so much for being here. I'm very honored and slightly nervous because I've made a sort of ambitious slideshow. So let's see how much fun we can have. Oh wait, hang on, 2 ticks. Share screen. Here. So much stuff here. Sometimes I like to start with this video clip because I think it's a groovy clip, but also like slightly kind of a red herring. I ask here, Qu'est-ce que c'est Gay Bar, which is a reference to a 1964 article in a self-published pamphlet by an activist from San Francisco called Guy Straight. Given name Strait. And one of the things that I think is interesting about his answer to Qu'est-ce que c'est Gay Bar, the first criterion is freedom of speech. So he says the use of idioms and unguarded sex talk in these spaces kind of define what that space is. And he also made a guide to gay lingo called the Lavender Lexicon. And so I'll use that kind of opening too to kind of give a trigger warning that in some of the readings that I'll do tonight, there's sort of dirty language and also reclaimed pejoratives used but by myself and some pals that come into the book from the LGBTQ plus population. Try to keep it relatively clean, but it's not totally clean. So trigger warning. But another reason that I show this slide, besides introducing this idea of a space being defined by its use of language, is because it's a clip from Soul Train, and that'll come back in earlier in terms of an expansive idea about a gay bar in terms of when underground queer spaces might have some kind of crossover into mainstream pop culture. one of the reasons that I am honored and a little bit nervous to be here tonight as a part of a history project is because I'm not a historian. I'm an essayist. I have a great deal of respect for the archive and how we use it. And I actually trained at the Royal College of Art in the UK under a historian, David Crowley. So he kept me in check, my meanderings in check. But my kind of primary strategy is as an essayist, and forgive me for being pedantic or basic for people who are very familiar with this, but to essay as a verb is to attempt or to make an often tentative or experimental effort to put to a test. And so in Gay Bar in particular, I am essaying about attempting to understand something like these Adelphi tunnels built in the 1700s in London. The concept of a basic gay by the artist Hal Fisher, who's referring to the clone culture in San Francisco in the 70s. This Odetta album, her first album, was recorded at a lesbian-owned bar in San Francisco in its first year in 1954. And the questions keep coming, you know, is it a lesbian bar just because it's owned by a lesbian? And all sorts of questions come up as I researched and wrote this book. The subtitle is really important. It's kind of a triple pun, why we went out in terms of going out as in socializing, why we went out as in out of the closet, and obviously the idea that these bars are going out of business and closing. So I conceived the book around 2016, 2017. I actually wrote the book in a very consolidated period of time, sort of 2019 to 2020, in the space of about 11 months. But I had been rooting around with the ideas and the concepts for years. And this was prompted by, I live in the UK mostly, and there, by 2016, 2017, over half the bars in the city, in the nation had closed within a year. So this brings up questions about, you know, it was such a widespread phenomenon, and the UK is such a small island that it became a news story, and it was in all the broadsheet papers, all the mainstream news. Whereas here it was a little bit more diffuse and harder to quantify the kind of numbers of bars that were closing. And the overarching narrative in the mainstream press was, this is a lamentable thing. These places afforded safe spaces. There was this common vocabulary around it. And I wanted to kind of go in and write this as an essayist, questioning, not only lamenting the loss of it, but kind of questioning the narratives around the loss, and wondering if these gay bars are closing, is that the kind of closure of gay identity altogether? It was a very strange thing for me to kind of confront the idea that I've been kind of self-identified or given this identity that then has these monuments throughout a given city, or of course in towns and rural spaces, but I concentrate in urban spaces, and to see them going out as somehow kind of emblematic of a change in identity. The book was informed by an art project by Hannah Quinlan and Rosie Hastings, who happened to be neighbors of mine when I lived in London, where they visited over 100 gay bars in the nation in this period of a lot of them closing. And one of the things that really struck me about their work is they weren't only visiting the kinds of places that they might feel comfortable as a lesbian couple, for one thing. They were investigating a really wide spectrum of places. Some of them are like really cheesy and tacky furniture and all kinds of good stuff that happens in a gay bar. I mean, going back to that Qu'est-ce que c'est gay bar, he kind of answers the question just by writing the title in French, doesn't he? In a way, it's like pretentiousness might be a part of what defines a gay bar. And I kind of wanted to follow in that. And I think it's important also to mention that, like, besides my idea of essaying, I'm also kind of playing around with music a lot. Like, I almost see what I do as being comparable to being a DJ or a collage artist, and taking cues from people like this is really important to my work, to artists as well as theorists, anthropologists, lawyers, all kinds of stuff. I think Proust said something about that fact that like, just say it in somebody else's words if you can't come up with anything better, because you probably won't. And so there's a lot of quotation in the book. And here are some of my photographs of bars in the UK as I was writing the book, which you can see kind of take a bit of inspiration from those artists. They're a quick set. The Cock Tavern in London, the gay sign is in Margate. It's a place called Sundowners. The flying handbag has the garbage, the bag of rubbish on the stage. And then the one in Bath, I forgot its name, it's in Bath. So I'm going to take you through a few different chapters in kind of summary and what they kind of emblemize. I mean, the strategy of my book, as some of you will know who have read it, is that I use places that I frequented or that had some kind of meaning in my life as starting points to discuss various aspects of what these kinds of spaces represent, what they've meant. I can't remember my first. It was someplace in Los Angeles, is the first two sentences of the second paragraph. And this kind of establishes a few different things that I'm using, for lack of a better word, autoethnography as a kind of strategy. I kind of like recently the term cultural memoir. I mean, as much as you can like genre terms at all. I can't remember my first establishes that memory is unreliable. And one thing that I think that I am embarking upon as a kind of ongoing project as a writer is, what is it to have a sort of unreliable narrator in nonfiction? When we read fiction, we always expect the characters to be flawed. Otherwise, we don't consider them to be believable. But when we read nonfiction, we have kind of come to expect a authoritative, kind of perfect and flawless companion. And though I'd like to be companionable in many ways, I'm kind of a bit troubling the idea of some kind of great objective idea of nonfiction. And as well, there's a question of agency here. I kind of have jokingly in the press referred to myself as a social bottom. I was taken to my first gay bar. It's not something I sought out in particular. I was identified as gay because of my mannerisms and my interest in all kinds of things by straight girls largely, and taken along, like pushed into the back of a sedan in one scene I am, and taken along to these places. And then when I get to these places, there's a kind of ambiguity or complexity of what they actually are and what they have been over time. So you could say in a way that my first gay bar was this spot called Probe in Los Angeles. By then it was the kind of venue that many cities have where there's different nights of the week. I think the first time I went there was for Citrusonic, which was like a house night, mostly straight. They had 1970, which was like a disco costume party. Before my time there, it was a private gay men's club starting in 1978. And before that, in the early 70s, it was known as the Paradise Ballroom. And there, largely Black and brown gay men practiced dance moves, which were known as punking or whacking, and we now associate as crossing over with voguing on the East Coast. And one of the things that it's only mentioned in about a sentence, if that, in the book, but I found it really interesting, and that's why I opened the show with Soul Train, and is that these dancers, these clubbers were going to auditions on the weekend to be on Soul Train and bringing their moves. And I think it's a really interesting and kind of, I think, historically overlooked crossover of these spaces moving into the mainstream.
Once you get started, it's just can't stop. When you get younger, when you get down, and I'm party. It's back in the groove. I like
So I don't know how to how many people this is sort of a surprising revisit to Soul Train, but for me, growing up watching Soul Train reruns, it was my entry point into Black music culture, and I hadn't really thought about the intersectionality of how queer it was until researching the book. And it's sort of one of those things that's kind of hidden in plain sight, that there are these, I hope you recognize, kind of like what we now might call whacking or voguing moves here on mainstream, on national television, hidden in plain sight. Somebody kindly pointed out that I have been self-cropping my face with the camera. Is it better if somebody could tell me in the chat? Because I can't really see myself. Yeah, cool. So as Probe, after Paradise Ballroom, it was a private gay men's club, and it had a very particular aesthetic. So we're talking starting in 1978. And by 1979, an American sociologist reported, quote, "The fastest proliferating type of establishment in the gay bar business is a place where gay men can declare with gusto that they are not like women." So it was like a butch or mask night. There's a whole vocabulary around that I think we kind of are quite shocked and sort of troubled by today. Like in the flyer for War Games, you probably can barely read it, but it says Probe invites all able-bodied men to War Games, a universe. It's like blatantly ableist. Night Stalker is a bit of an intense one in terms of the fact that I can only imagine it was named for Richard Ramirez, the serial killer who put a chill into my nights as a child growing up in California. The flyer for that reads, "He had arrived in the rain and his boots stunk of wet leather. I found that I liked it. If my mother knew, I'd be so ashamed. He took me to a corner of the club. He made me do all sorts of things. He acted as if he was stalking me, actually. Like an animal, I shivered." And in this kind of era, when it had this hyper masculine, what we refer to sometimes as clones, clientele, and this kind of dark vibe, it was in the movie American Gigolo, and kind of stood for what gay bars often do in movies, which is a place of sin and depravity. I'll let you look out for the clones in hard hats and sniffing poppers and things. So. I think that was Peter Berlin, the San Francisco familiar face on the streets in there, the blonde guy. Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. Is my microphone level okay? There was a note in the chat. My microphone is just ambient, so I'm just basically speaking into my laptop. The microphone, yeah?
It's a little low. So
yeah?
it was good
okay.
at the beginning. I don't know what Zoom is doing.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Is it better if I just speak a little bit louder? Does that kind of help if I project as if I'm in a theater and I'm trying to hit the back row?
That sounds,
yeah?
Everyone in the chat is saying yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
You. I'll try to keep my voice relatively sonorous as well as the clips. Around the time that I arrived in Los Angeles, it was 1992 and AIDS was pronounced that year as the leading cause of death for young men in the nation. Probe had introduced a telephone line, 976 Probe, which I find interesting as a kind of precursor to dating apps like a Grindr. And then it still had, as a multi-venue, as a multi-party venue, it still had gay parties, but they had this kind of very cleaned up, Marky Mark underwear, Calvin Klein, very polished, sort of hygienic, kind of like this sort of promotion of uncontaminated bodies. I think it's very emblematic of the AIDS of the post-AIDS era. And now that space is an antique shop, so I've just popped that side in there. The owners say that they can every once in a while detect a whiff of poppers. Did somebody just say in the chat there, X used 976 Probe? I mean, the funny thing about those numbers is I don't know if people remember in the room where it's like obviously all it needed to be is PROB to coordinate with a digit, but they've just put the E on because you could just dial it anyway. Of course, I can't remember my first gay bar. I was drunk. Subsequent forays into nightlife went something like dragged from a party in the hills where students hung like cufflinks off older men, shoved into the back of Matthias's sedan, released onto a throbbing dance floor. At Circus, we entered through a malicious clown's grin. It was very interesting for me to revisit my memories and think, is it possible that something so kind of unreal and spectacular really existed, and then to go back on, now it's so easy to find online that Circus did indeed exist. It has a very fleeting cameo in the book, but it was popular with the Latinx population at the time. And also actually Cesar Chavez appeared there and kind of held the meeting that had to do with solidarity between different population groups and the labor movement. So the era that I arrived was this kind of club kid era. I'm just going to read to you here, and there'll be a couple more readings I pepper throughout. The nightlife stretch of Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood hummed like a neon tube. Bright pink shops sold homoerotic mugs and magnets. The party atmosphere was entrenched but subdued. Groups of gays gossiped al fresco over amaretto sours. West Hollywood, incorporated as its own city in 1984, had been dubbed the Gay Camelot and then officially marketed as the Creative City in an effort to draw not just gay bar tourists, but design aficionados. Creative was a way to connote gays zhuzhing up the place. Gays were thought to be especially well adapted to the post-industrial economy, experts in leisure and aesthetics. A 1985 issue of Urban Geography put it this way: gay people, quote, emphasize exchange value. In other words, their hype and flourish raised costs for everyone else. In actuality, the organizing principle in establishing West Hollywood's cityhood had been a push for strict rent control. Ultimately, anyway, nobody referred to it as the Creative City. It was Boys Town. I didn't have a fake ID yet, so mostly the bars were just background noise. Come to think of it, the first gay threshold I crossed must have been that coffee house on the boulevard. It buzzed like a normal cafe with intermittent shrieking. Matthias and I joined some other students he knew. They wore sweatshirts rolled above the wrist. I could tell right off the most amiable by far was Oliver, a tall ballet dancer with soft black skin who had the habit of smoothing his eyebrow with his middle finger, palm fanning out. He smiled at me shyly. No, he smiled at me slyly, his eyes kind even as he angled his face at a lordly oblique. Taller still was the chiseled sophomore who carried himself with the indignance of a politician's son. There were older men at our table and adjoining, with raw sausage fingers groping cigarettes and stubble as dense as sand. They cackled UCL gay, meaning homosexuals abounded. I'd so far only heard the other crack, University of Caucasians lost among Asians. I was the butt of both of these jokes, but had little attachment to either distinction. Still, a part of me flinched at being corralled into a punchline. The guys at the table seemed so confident, jaded already. They sat with impudent elbows and ankles. I'd heard it said that gays were perpetually adolescent, but I was convinced this particular sampling had never been boys in the first place. They assessed instead of greeted. They laughed like they'd already butt fucked. They looked down long noses with the pride of a man with an ass made only for fucking, as if there never was shit. They used phrases like fresh meat as they recrossed their legs. They spoke as if words were handed to them to disgrace. They were swishy, not mincing, but like a sword slicing air. They were satisfied with cliche. They dismissed whole populations with one sting. Bottoms and tops were fixed positions. To have a clear racial preference was a highly amusing character trait. It became a part of their repertoire of innuendos. If someone liked black men, for instance, he goes to catch one was all that needed to be said. And I'll say on a side note here that there's a documentary about Catch One on Netflix you can watch, should be still on Netflix. It says somebody said it was their favorite passage in the book. Actually, that's I think that's part of the reason I got a book deal was for that passage. This chapter really winds up focusing on the factory building, which by the time I got there was hosting a club called Studio One. It was on the verge of changing it to being called Axis, but still a gay bar. Super cheesy, really basic, very routine, and unsurprising, even for a first gay bar. And I had no idea that in the 70s, it was like the destination, the 70s and 80s, Studio One. It's in a Village People song. And I should say, you know, the sole remaining member of the Village People, the sole surviving member is really litigious and doesn't want anybody to ever associate Village People with gay culture. But let's say the audience members of the Village People were often gay men. And so Studio One has a resonance being mentioned in their song, Everybody is a Star in Hollywood. Before that, it was the Mitchell Camera Corporation. And I think this is really interesting, going back to that idea of gay men in particular, gay men and lesbians being kind of agents of gentrification, in terms of the fact that, yes, West Hollywood follows this trajectory of kind of moving as gentrification, as the narrative of gentrification goes from an industrial economy to a service and amusement economy. But at the same time, here they were manufacturing these cameras. So amusement was always a part of that equation. And then there's this kind of troubling aspect where a lot of the imagery used feels quite white supremacist, and there are accusations of racism, sexism, and transphobia at the door. There's also a kind of existential question here.
Even the dances have a depersonalized quality to them. The hustle and the bus stop, for instance. In both, you have 50 or 100 people lined up, dancing the same way, completely unattached to each other, simply doing the same movements like robots. Like lemmings, they begin to form those lines. I can envision the day when we all just walk up to the same entrance of a disco, put a bunch of quarters in a slot, enter, and become immediately surrounded by music. Then each of us will go into a space the size of a telephone booth and dance by ourselves.
I really loved finding this. I really loved finding this quote from a kind of anonymous Studio One regular in the Los Angeles Times, because it, like the phone line kind of predates apps, that seems to kind of predict TikTok or just all kind of social life online, where we don't really interact with each other. We want to be seen, but there isn't that kind of see and be seen, that kind of give and take that there is in social spaces. So it was very interesting for me that that building was being demolished in real time right during the year, debated and then demolished while I was writing the book. The current plan, it has been demolished, and the current plan is to keep some of that framework and implement it into the design of this shopping and hotel complex. which just looks a little arbitrary. I don't know if it really tells a historical story as much as just gives a kind of aesthetic. I mean, it kind of just looks like an Urban Outfitters or something to me. And another important part of gay bars that I leave bars and I talk about other kinds of spaces. Here's Circus of Books. Also, there's a Netflix documentary, Astro Burger, which is where I lived, kind of in between me and where the male prostitutes and trans prostitutes hung out on Santa Monica Boulevard. There's a passage that some of you might be familiar with who have read the book where I venture into the adult cinema. Out of the closet is a AIDS charity shop, and that passage shows my kind of squeamishness about disease as a young person coming out in that era. And one of the kind of main strategies, I suppose, that I use as I write is just to walk, to perambulate. These are both images that I took while writing the book, and it's transitioning us from the factory in Los Angeles to this section of the Adelphi district in London. It was important for me, and there's a romance at the heart of the book. It was important for me because me and my partner had I had a bar that we would go to called the Retro Bar. If you look at this picture of London today, this is a pretty telling image of, the bar used to be called the Pop Stars Bar at the time that we frequented it. It's now called the Retro Bar. But here we go. Here's like this takeaway on the top of a ballast that keeps a certain kinds of traffic from moving through, and these like workaday black clad zombies in the background. This is very contemporary London, I must say. But one of the main, and this is what it looked like before. Seems maybe a bit more life filled market and other businesses. But one of the main, another main kind of strategy that I use is just toponymy, just looking at a place like that it happened to be on George Court. And I realized that it was called George Court because that land once upon a time belonged to George Villiers. It was given to him by King James VI and First. So we're talking early 1600s, and George Villiers was a favorite and probably paramour. King James called him my sweet child and wife, and bequeathed this land, or not bequeathed, but passed over this land to him, as well as the title the Duke of Buckinghamshire. So it was George Villiers' son, the second Duke of Buckinghamshire, who was there when the land was returned to public land. And he insisted that all the streets be named after his father. So George Court is where that bar was on. And also there's a Duke Street, a Villiers Street, a Buckinghamshire. There's even an of, like, because he's Duke of Buckinghamshire Street, which I find amusing. And it actually isn't in the book. So that's a little special feature from the cutting room floor. And it's just interesting to me that there's this kind of palimpsest of gay histories where we've got, I mean, if you can call it gay, we've got King James and his paramour. We've got then the Roberts brothers built this Georgian project called the Adelphi. And underneath the terrace houses were these tunnels that became, they were very ripe for cruising. And that's one way in which they operated for several years until the 1933 Adelphi Estate Bill, which reorganized that area for various, ostensibly for various reasons, but a lot of it actually was to curb cruising. The local urinal was especially notorious. The senior judge recommended it to be abolished in the interest of the community. One police officer testified that the low-lit areas amounted to a resort of persons of the sodomite class. Between 1930 and 1932, 70 persons were arrested in the vicinity for importuning and acts of gross indecency. And by the time that this kind of coded language was used to change the infrastructure of the area, it's the historian Matt Holbrook's belief that, quote, the operations of municipal power in redeveloping the modern city were predicated upon the coordinated exclusion of queer men. And I think that you might kind of find a parallel today in what we now call defensive architecture or hostile design, in terms of things like, for instance, various structures that are in cities that are there to prevent skateboarding and rough sleeping or houseless encampment. Some of the only tunnels that exist now are in the are in the Royal Society of the Arts underneath, and they just get a kick out of the fact that it's rentable for weddings. This once kind of insalubrious zone is now, as it says in that bottom picture, glitzy. And Villiers Street is actually where Heaven is, which is probably one of the most well-known clubs in London. And I don't focus on Heaven very much because I kind of shy away in gay bar from the big ones. As people who have read the book will know, I only mentioned Stonewall, for instance, in about a half a paragraph. But here's a clip from Heaven anyway, because it's pretty delightful.
This is Heaven, one of London's newest and smartest discos. It's situated in the West End, and on some nights, more than 2,000 people come here. But there's one rather surprising aspect about these people. Almost all of them are men. And that's because Heaven is a gay disco, a night spot for homosexual men.
I don't know if anybody actually recognized that clip. They kept playing it over and over again in the Andy Warhol documentary that was recently on, was it also Netflix? I'm not being paid by Netflix, but it was interesting to me that they used that clip to try to, it was like a kind of a stand-in for Studio 54 and other gay and mixed nightclub nightlife in New York City, even though that was a clip from British television of Heaven. Which goes to this question about like the subjectivity of history. And I've called this a kind of palimpsest of queer coincidences, but historians like John D'Amelio have given a critique of reading backward in time and can you really call gay, for instance, the relationship between a king and a subservient. Wayne Kaustenbaum gives this quote, "For gayness to be more than a mere lifestyle or recreational choice, for it to be an encyclopedia, a geography, a wealth of roots and signs, it must acknowledge its own capacious interpretive mannerisms as more than manner, as matter." And it just kind of, that encapsulates to me my investigation here, where I'm really like touching buildings and walking through spaces and trying to figure out what went before me. The final chapter I'll discuss is the windows in San Francisco. As many people probably know, the Twin Peaks Tavern is famous for being it's regarded as the first bar in the nation to use large plate glass windows. And because of that, people can, not only can the clientele look out, but people can look in. And it incurred this sort of self-policing, actually. Mary Ellen Kuna and Peggy Forster, the women who ran the bar, they were inspired by these fern bars that were these straight pickup joints that were supposed to be like kind of unsleazy because they had ferns and things like Tiffany lamps. The first one is credited to be the first one that is TGI Fridays, the now a chain. The original one was in New York City, and it was next to a building where a bunch of flight attendants lived, and it was supposed to be women friendly. They had classy events like Ladies Night. One in San Francisco, you can see this guy above, was called Henry Africa. So they took their cue from that. You can see there's actually ferns and stained glass, Tiffany lamp, stained glass lamps. And, but yeah, this self-policing, it's an interesting trajectory. I won't get it into too much because we're kind of running out of time, but the Black Cat Cafe in North Beach was a really monumental one because it won a California Supreme Court case where Sol Stuman, the proprietor, who actually was a Holocaust survivor, it was a mixed bar, but they were being, you know, regularly raided for providing a resort for homosexuals. And the kind of ultimate decision was that that it was legal for homosexuals to congregate, but not necessarily to do homosexual things, like showing signs of affection or hitting on one another. And I find this very interesting because these legal opinions, and we're very familiar with this today with cases like Roe v. Wade being revisited, and the potential repercussions that has for gay marriage and so on and so forth. These legal opinions have a kind of carry a philosophical weight. Here, what is the question of conduct versus status? What is it to be a gay person versus do gay things? And Cunha and Forster, when they opened the Twin Peaks Tavern, in a way, they kind of began to self-police the way that gay bars used to be policed. And it was a no-touch bar. You weren't allowed to show signs of affection. So the question is, does that mean that you're creating a kind of wholesome, respectable, anodyne gay identity? In the book, I contrast it with let me show these really quickly. This is a part of that respectability project was that when the Twin Peaks joined the Tavern Guild would have a softball game with the San Francisco Police Department. I think this footage is amazing. You'll notice the drag queens letting off balloons. And this guy right there in the mustache, that kind of cutie pie, was actually on the side of the fuzz, the cops. There was a really funny quote I found there, the drag queens, in the Bay Area Reporter. Quote, "A special cheer rose up from our throats, deafening as at the introduction of Walter Scott, son of the chief, who had trouble keeping himself tucked into his cutoffs, necessitating constant readjustment to our amusement." And it's interesting to think, many people in this room will be familiar with the White Night riots in the aftermath of the assassination of the San Francisco gay politician Harvey Milk. And it was the elephant walk down the street that took the hit. I don't know if the Twin Peaks was spared because of this kind of sense of camaraderie that they had built with the police, but that's what happened. And in the chapter, I contrast these kinds of spaces with the more clandestine ones, like a private fisting club called the Catacombs, which I lean heavily on a Gail Rubin essay called The Temple of the Butthole, in which she describes the goings-on there as both transgressive, but also community building in her point of view. And Gail Rubin was a contemporary of Michel Foucault, who wrote, "I actually liked the scene before gay liberation, when everything was more covert. It was like an underground fraternity, exciting and a bit dangerous. Friendship meant a lot. It meant a lot of trust. We protected each other. We related to each other by secret codes." Some of you may be familiar with the fact that this 1964 photograph of the toolbox published in Life magazine was a big incidental, it was supposed to be scandalous and sort of judgmental, but it was an incidental tourism advertisement bringing a lot of gay men to San Francisco. A lot of readers hadn't even heard the term homosexuality before. And now, as the historian Martin Meeker puts it, it was intrinsically linked to a place. Los Angeles and New York in the article, but namely San Francisco. And when the bar was demolished, the mural actually stood for several years and was this kind of like welcoming sign near the freeway. That chapter ends in 2002 at a gay shame protest. Gay shame is kind of a protest against respectability politics. This is happening right in front of the Twin Peaks Tavern. They were very anti-gay marriage, this activist group in the early 2000s, and I'm very conflicted in this passage because my partner and I have a transnational relationship that needed gay marriage or some kind of civil partnership for us to achieve legal migration status. There's this line there where I say I join in that party, but I was there, I joined in that party, but I kind of am wondering if the night might just end in a burrito or a three-way, even though it's supposed to be a street protest. So if I'm going to kind of round it up with this one last reading. Basically, the bars in this book, a lot of the post in the aftermath of the spread of the AIDS epidemic, a lot of bars were, and this is when I was coming out, where they had this very wiped clean, hygienic uncontaminatable, undirty, what Johan Anderson, an urbanist from London, calls shishi bars. And it took me a while to kind of find my place. And it kind of happened through a revisiting of more like 1970s cruise culture vibes at this retro-oriented bar at a place called Aunt Charlie's in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. I actually found this picture of myself there in the denim jacket while I was researching the book. I didn't know it existed, but it was published in some magazine. So proof that I was there. And this is kind of, this last reading is kind of how I felt about this reclamation maybe of a sort of raunchier, I suppose, gay identity.
Between 11 and midnight, the neon sign above the bar, spelling out Aunt Charlie's, would be turned off and eventually a strobe light shattered the tiny dance floor into pieces. The maximum number of randy young fags who could possibly fit squeezed their way in. Somehow, we still made the space to dance expressively. There was Matthew back from another trek through the wilds, his arms spread wide as if proselytizing. There was Ricky, you could smell his patchouli. The carpet was going threadbare underfoot. Our enthusiasm threatened to make the records jump and skid. I have never heard this song before, I said to Famous repeatedly. Bus Station John would politely decline to divulge the name of the track. The mix was far from seamless. It halted and lurched. There were lots of vocals, so many sisterly, triumphant, empowered, positive messages. Piano lines rolled through the room like illuminated ships pulling into a city harbor. Bus Station John told a local paper, there's not just a gap, but a chasm between generations that age created. Their absence is felt by those of us who are old enough to feel it, but the younger ones are never going to know about them unless we tell them. We went out to be told. We went out to feel it. We went out to experience how it used to be, and Bus Station John was happy to be our gay liberation daddy. A mature writer for a gay newspaper reported that the 70s bathhouse vibe at Tubescape Connection was, quote, so authentic people were actually cruising. For years, checking one another out meant scrutinizing. A potential rival, possibly diseased, the type of gay who gives gay a bad name. Here we recognized instead, saw the other's strength and sense of humor. The dancing was not posturing, it was celebration and foreplay. Finally, like Aaron Shuren reminisced of his gay bar, we too knew hard-ons in company. Some boy would pull me into a deep kiss after midnight. I was aware I did not look untouchable. Anything remotely expensive looking about me was on discount by that late hour. So I got used to the attention, boys handling my damaged goods. Once, when I had just arrived, already blind drunk, someone locked his mouth over mine, depriving me of air to the point where I thought I might pass out or vomit. On another occasion, an inebriated skateboarder, new to town, decided to come home with Famous and me, and then did throw up behind a dumpster on the street. He shook his long burgundy hair, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and continued to our place to have a glass of water and give head.
A quick epilogue. This is an area where I live in the UK, and coincidentally, right before I left, there was this art installation, which is called St. Leonard's Smallest Gay Bar. And I went in. It was hard to, you kind of wanted to stay in there. It was one in, one out. And it's interesting to think of the fact that of the gay bar kind of being monumentalized, these kind of aesthetics you once have thought is sort of like arbitrary, being kind of like monumentalized by artists. It seems to be a bit of a movement in the UK. As for me, I'm here in Los Angeles now, and this is kind of the closest I get to a gay bar. I live in a quiet area currently, and my current favorite thing to do is take a walk and get some bubble tea. And I think one of the things that I kind of want to, I just reviewed a book for The Guardian called The Kingdom of Sand by Andrew Holleran, who wrote the infamous and deservedly celebrated book of 1970s disco nightlife, Dancer from the Dance. And it's a book about older gay men, and he's in his 60s, but he sort of acts like he's in his 80s, and his closest friend in the neighborhood is in his 80s. And yeah, I'll just leave it there. I'll just open up that idea that we all change individually as well as culturally, and that's why my trips to the local bubble tea shop kind of reminded me of this melancholic book, Kingdom of Sand by Andrew Holleran, and the fact that a lot of times when, we'll see if there's any questions, a lot of times I get asked like what the future of the gay bar is, which I have no idea. I wrote Why We Went Out, not what's coming next, so I'm not really sure, but I think the kids are always going to find a way to party. I think one thing that always should be on people's mind is how our elders continue to be afforded ways in which to hang out too. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. I hope that mostly worked. It's a hard thing to do, to give a multimedia public presentation on Zoom, and hopefully it's okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I want to turn us over to audience questions. So if folks can either use the hand raise feature, or if you are in video and don't know where the hand raise feature is and want to wave at me, I will unmute you. And I can also comment. I was taking notes about when you were talking about the tunnels being the tunnels being people trying to eradicate the gays from the tunnels in London. I mean, in Boston, we had entire streets changed directions to stop people from picking up other people in the city. And there's a great, somebody else will remember, who's the historian working on the Tuileries? Somebody at Bennington. His name will come to me after this, but this sort of idea of like gay history through the history of cruising, I think is really interesting and important. Andrew says it's Vaseline Alley. I don't know what is Vaseline Alley, but Steve Shapiro is the historian. So yeah, the block is the block that was the streets were turned around, and Barney Frank had something to do with that. But anyway, any questions, comments, favorite gay bars, least favorite gay bars?
That should be in there too. I mean, I can just give it, if anybody, I know we're running out of time, but if anybody has a question, please do put it in the chat. But I can kind of respond to that idea of least favorite gay bars and just say that I think one of the things that the book has been out since 2021 and is now newly out in paperback. So it's had a life of its own already. And I think one of the things that maybe has surprised people, and in the beginning, I paid a little bit of attention to what people's impressions of the book were online, even though you're not supposed to. And I quickly learned that that's the reason why. But one of the things I think is that people were surprised by is the fact that I kind of focus in certain areas on problematic aspects of given bars rather than purely celebrating them. And I think that's a really important aspect of what I do. I would defend that you have to look at the things that are not so admirable that happened in these places, as well as the joy. And I've been edited in the past, like I've gone on the radio and I've said, you know, I said on radio in England, they said, tell us about disco. And I said, yeah, it was liberation. And it was, there was a lot of joie de vivre on the dance floor. But there was also racist and sexist and transphobic door policies. And when it went on air the next morning, they just cut me right out after I said, joie de vivre on the dance floor, and then cut to, I'm coming out. And it was a surprising act for me to witness. And I was very mortified of anybody who might listen and know that I have a sense of depth about what happened in these places, that there's something kind of censorious about the way that we treat the past, that we only want to see the things that fit a particular agenda or just like give us good times feelings.
There's a fine line between wanting to highlight queer joy. It is what I've seen a lot of how it's described online, the idea that the past is not a bad thing. The past wasn't a bad thing, but you need to, it's not one way or another. It's not fair to not talk about it in a nuanced way.
Sure.
Yeah, Kira, you have a question, so I will unmute you or comment.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, fantastic book. I really enjoyed. I listened to the audiobook and it was wonderful to like hear it in your own voice as well. But something I think especially I really appreciated like some of the criticisms of these. I think there are a lot of, especially in COVID, really rosy remembrances of gay bars, but I'm 23, I turned 21 about 2 months before the pandemic hit. So I went to approximately one suburban gay bar for 20 minutes. And that was my like first experience of one, and haven't really had too many opportunities to go since. And I think something that was really interesting about that is kind of like thinking about what does the gay bar mean to like people my age, and like especially as like someone who operates in like a lot of queer women circles, there's so few of those bars left. Like I think hearing all of those really rosy depictions sometimes can leave you feeling this sense of like true loss of a community that like you were never able to have. But I think hearing some more of the kind of complicated aspects of kind of that culture, it gave me, I think, some just more to think about, especially as thinking about what do those spaces look like moving forward for people who maybe do not necessarily have that, you know, at my age where a lot of our like first bar going experiences are very like marred by this change in how we've interacted with each other, both because of the pandemic and because of social media. So that wasn't really a question, but more of a comment and appreciation for your work.
Oh, thank you so much. And for sure, I mean, you know, Bus Station John, the DJ who I referred to in that last reading that I had showed that pre-recorded reading, he came up to me in San Francisco and he went, you know, Jeremy, you say in the book that you were late to the party, but you arrived for the after party. And I feel like there's always something, you know, next that comes along. And I think one of the things that one of the things in terms of what that kind of rosy, or let's even say like in a very particular way about gay identity, the kind of camp, glitzy, like let your hair down aesthetic that gay has come to represent, is that it means that we've sort of, that it's sort of, there has been a kind of letting go. I mean, you know, gay bars are a place for bachelorettes to go and party now. And there's a kind of colonization of the gay bar. And to me, I'm a bit like, well, they can have it. You know, it has been this thing. It represents something to a new population who's taken over, and that, you know, other people are the people who maybe were there in the beginning might lament its changes, but they'll find someplace else. The party will rove. It's interesting to see what the changes are going to be and how we can't control them. And maybe sometimes to have not only that critical faculty about the complex things that they've represented, but also a sense of humor. And the fact that, you know, you go to a gay bar and you're like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. I feel particularly uncomfortable being my kind of queer person and whatever in this space. And you have to kind of figure out, I think the thing that I feel for you in terms of being so young and being caught in lockdown is a part of that experience of going out is serendipity in a joyful way, but also surprise and sometimes a slightly troubling way, or just in an awkward way. I came across this meme recently, you know, like a fit check on TikTok where somebody shows like their outfit. And I came across this meme of a young guy like showing off his going out outfit. And the caption said, "One bad vibe and I'm out. This is my going out outfit, one bad vibe and I'm out." And I thought, what does that mean? If there's one bad vibe in the space that you're going out to tonight, you're going to go home and make more narcissistic videos. And I think one of the things it brought to my mind was that one of the reasons why we go out is that there are going to be some bad vibes, and you learn from them, and maybe you change somebody else's mind, or they change your mind, or there's this give and take. And I think as we are able to healthfully and safely return to being together in the same space, it's going to be so positive for humanity. I hope, I am optimistic about this, that we will be able to engage in a dialogue, not just a monologue that we give each other on social media.
That was great. Thank you, Kira, for that question, and Jeremy for your answer. So we usually wrap at 8. I would like to stick around because we have a couple of really great questions in the chat. So we're going to do that. But if folks need to log off, no harm, no foul. Jordan had a couple of questions. The first is, do you consider your work to be in tradition of Guillaume Dustan? Is that how you pronounce that, Jordan? Their autofiction / memoirs. And then the follow-up to that was, what role do you see the rise of queer personal narrative playing, or what gaps are these sorts of narratives filling?
Autofiction, I mean, it's funny, memoir, when you write nonfiction, like I literally had a meeting with a lawyer who had me change a couple things to protect, it was like privacy issues in terms of not, so autofiction is a funny one, because in a way, sometimes I wish that I could just call my work fiction, because then you can get away with anything. Whereas weirdly, you could actually sort of almost in a way be more forthcoming. Whereas when you write nonfiction, you are constantly told to change things so that you avoid lawsuits and unwanted attention and all this kind of stuff. So genre is just this morass, I don't know. All I know is that I don't think like a novelist. I don't have that kind of imagination. So my imagination works like we might engage in conversation, and that's how I write. What role do you see the rise of queer personal narrative playing, or what gaps are they filling? Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of like, this is a huge history there, right? From feminism and all kinds of marginal voices using the personal voice to testify in a way. And for that testimony to be considered, there's always been this fight for that testimony to be considered valid and worthwhile. But it's what we know, and it's where we come from. I mean, obviously I don't speak for all gays, and why we went out, the we is really me and my buddies, or me and my partner, and it's a bit of a ruse or a red herring that I would be able to speak for a whole population or identity group. Yeah, that's in brief. I do have to say, though, also, I suppose what you're maybe getting at is that also that there's a proliferation of titles coming out that I think kind of are in a similar register to what I do. One just came out yesterday called All Down Darkness Wide, which is a much more intimate book, but it's one that I endorsed by Sean Hewitt, the book about Fire Island by Jack Parlett. There are so many books coming out in this register now, and it seems like I'm trepidatious that maybe the media will try to make it some kind of movement, rather than the fact that it's just, there are probably just more opportunities in publishing. So I don't know if it's really a wave as much as just kind of a breakdown of previous barriers.
Great. There's a lot going on in the chat talking about gay bars in Northampton that may or may not still exist, or that there's no gay bars in Northampton, which makes me feel like we need to do an event about the history of Northampton gay bars. So if anyone is an expert on that, please reach out. There was also one question from Jean that I thought was interesting about, so you have this transnational experience between England and the US. Jean mentions in Hong Kong coming across a friend in a bar, in a gay bar half a world away. And they're asking if that's still possible in our time to have that kind of, I don't know if international, I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, Jean, but like to have that kind of international connection, or to have that space to connect with one another. Do you feel like,
I don't really have an answer for that, except to say that there's a particular kind of experience that I try to articulate in the book, which is that a lot of times when we move through a given city or through global networks, it has to do with a very careerist, kind of hierarchical, who's cool, that kind of stuff. This idea that, I remember just years ago arriving in New York City for a stay, and somebody saying like, "Oh, everybody's here this week." That kind of thing. That meant to be, and that was referring to people who are loosely in my social network of like people who are in art and fashion and things like that. And So sorry, this is like an oblique answer to Jean's question, but what I think sometimes a gay bar can represent is a sort of anonymity, a kind of place where you might be able to escape. I seek out those particular kinds of bars where there's a sense of like losing yourself. I think in the book, I kind of sort of play off of the sociologist Irving Goffman and have this line, "We go out to be nobodies." So you kind of create a new sense of what it is to be a somebody. If you can find a place that isn't predicated on like who you are and what you do, like that kind of stuff, but rather just like that sense of anonymity.
Right. So does anyone want the last question? Mark, you had your hand up for a while. Do you want to hop on? Okay. Okay, there we go.
Does that work? Okay.
Yes.
So I have two, but I'll ask one. So at the very center of going out is sometimes an unfulfilled promise, or chasing your tail, or never being totally satisfied, or hoping that the next person you meet will give you the sense that you might not be too bad looking after all, or too boring, or too whatever your fears are about yourself. And I wonder if there was, I loved your book and I read it. I think it was beautifully written. There are some great sentences, because I love sentences that are beautiful, and there are many in there. But there's a certain emptiness at the center of bar life, or can be, that I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like there is a melancholic register in the book that has to do with exactly that sense of longing, of unfulfilled longing, that kind of, there's a line in Armistead Malpound's Tales of the City about like the idea that there's always something better around the corner. And I think that's really a part of, that has been a part of, again, I don't want to speak sort of too broadly, but I think that has been a recurring aspect of gay male identity, and that is articulated in books also like Dancer from the Dance. That kind of insatiable quest. And so I really wanted that to be a part of the book. And I think maybe in a way it stands out, those parts stand out because they are perhaps somewhat less predictable. And the moments of kind of euphoria and camaraderie on the dance floor, like that last clip that I played at Tube State Connection in San Francisco. It's funny, I've been reading them out a lot because I feel that a lot of people kind of connect, and rightly so, to the more melancholic bits, but I do want to show that balance. So I've been bringing those out when I read out loud. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a pervasive aspect of the book.
There's a local author talks about going to a cruising spot and being like, who knows when you'll meet? Your husband will come through the door, so why not stick around for another couple hours? Which is kind of what Mark's question reminds me of. There's one final question. Rob, both of your questions are really good, but I'm gonna ask one of them. So final question, I promise this time. Rob is asking about gay separatism in gay spaces. So can you speak to that in the bars? Do you see that in your own experience?
I guess to expand on gay separatism, I see more and more members of the gay and queer community that feel out of place in straight spaces and only want gay friends, gay doctors, gay lawyers, etc. Oh wait, was that the follow-up to the question?
Yeah, well, that was basically the question was, there's an expansion of gay spaces. One example is drag queens in public libraries. And that with these changes, and I think what Rob is asking about, with a more accepting, gay people for the most part can go to a straight club and not have the same experience, but probably not get as harassed. as an example?
I don't know. It's a hard one for me to answer for anybody besides myself and in this moment and in my recent experience, which is just that, like, I can't really, there's no way that I could really be a gay separatist. Like I'm here in Los Angeles right now, spending loads of time with my family. I spend most of my time hanging out with my 7-year-old nephew and playing chase games in the swimming pool. And I think one of the things that, the only thing that I can speak to is that sometimes that kind of separatism is an impossibility for any reason. And the only real sense of community that we have is an old-fashioned version of that word, which is your happenstance, your geographical happenstance, where you happen to be. And I, maybe this sounds like I'm being a bit contrarian or something like that, but sometimes I feel the closest I feel to a sense of community when actually the person who's the receptionist at the local dentist turns out to be somebody that you can find despite your various differences, that you have some kind of companionability for a fleeting moment, or that the person down the street, you help them because their mobility scooter has lost its batteries. And I think it's really important. I guess I'm not a separatist is what I'm saying, because I don't think I can afford to be, because it would be closing down those kinds of opportunities to like hang out with a 7-year-old and learn all new phrases and ways of looking at the world from them, and the older person in my neighborhood that needs help and all that kind of stuff. But that's just me.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. Jeremy, thank you so much for the presentation and for the dive into the book. I've put some more links in the chat to the History Project's website, to our social media, and to purchase Gay Bar, which is available everywhere, but I put a link to East End Books, which is a local bookstore. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you again soon. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.